Hey guys, welcome back to Total Tactics FPL. It's Fran here, and I'm back with my Gameweek 21 cheat sheet preview. Thank you guys so much for the birthday wishes. It's really appreciated. Unfortunately, I'm stuck at home right now, and I've tested positive for COVID, so we'll see what happens there. But I'm trying to rest and get these videos out so that you guys can really enjoy and try to capitalize on 21 and 22. Right now, I have to say that 22 is a big fixture schedule because you have the high chances of double game weeks happening. We know that from all the great work that Ben Crellin has done, and also due to the fixture postponements that we've had from COVID so far. And the Premier League should announce later today what the fixtures are specifically for 21 and 22, and whether additional games such as the postponed game for between Leicester and Norwich could be moved further forwards into 22 as an example, because that's a great point in the schedule to actually allow for games to happen. Now, right now, this cheat sheet is going to be based around players and teams who specifically have high chances of double game weeks and also good fixtures themselves if we discount the maybe lower probability double game week fixtures where if let's say a fixture isn't rescheduled, they still have a good run ahead. I think one thing to point out is that in the very near future, you have teams like Arsenal and Chelsea who have big blanks ahead. Man City is a team who have single game weeks, but we know they're performing at such an elite level that I think it's very worth keeping at least two City players at this point in time, even if you are wildcarding and things like that. But let's go straight into the defenders. So with the defenders, the first fall of the week is going to go to Dalot. And the reason is because Wan-Bissaka just played 81 minutes versus Burnley, and that is not a good sign to kind of have Dalot in our team, right? Dalot is someone who we expected to be nailed because Aaron Wan-Bissaka didn't seem that creative in open play, and we thought that a attacking right back would be much more beneficial to the way this United team attacks. And we saw that in the Burnley game that Wan-Bissaka wasn't anything exceptional attacking, but once again, he's probably a little bit of a upgrade when it comes to Dalot in defense, and maybe that's what this United team needs, especially since they've conceded a lot of chances in recent weeks that they probably shouldn't have. Unfortunately, a lot of the defensive mistakes do come from individual errors as opposed to maybe team compactness and team shape. So that remains to be seen whether Rangnick will constantly rotate players like Dalot. I think that's going to be the case where Wan-Bissaka and Dalot are seen as options to rotate amongst each other. But that's not appetizing whatsoever when we head into a double game week where Dalot might only play a single and also maybe lose out on a clean sheet. If you're a Dalot owner this week, such as myself, you'd be basically staring at 1 point, which is not a very, very good haul. Lowton is someone who actually is new this week, and the reason why is because if you look at the game week possibilities, Burnley is set up to probably have a double game week in 22 and a very decent one as well, where at least Lowton, who's a very big set piece contributor to this team, can maybe get hopefully one clean sheet or at least maybe 1 or 2 assists, which would be interesting if the games do stack up for Burnley. As far as the 4.5 players, there's not much of a difference here. There's not much changes. I would say Tierney is someone who you probably want to look away from in the near future. In terms of bringing him into your team. If you have him already in your team, that's fine. That's someone you can kind of keep probably in the back of your bench. Davies and Dyer are definitely exceptional options at this point in time because they do have a double game week coming ahead. And not only that, but they have been interesting in open play, and the Spurs' underlying stats for defensive, from a defensive point of view, has been exceptionally good. And that's exactly why later on in this list, I will be kind of talking about Lloris as well. Wolves defenders do rise, and the reason is because they do have a small chance of a double game week in 22, not exceptionally high, but their fixtures are going to be very smooth, and we know that Wolves are actually the third side in the league with the least amount of goals conceded, which is a very, very, very great stat, as we've already hit the halfway mark in the season. So even though, yes, they are kind of overperforming their stats from an underlying point of view, we've already had enough sample size to know that this Wolves side is a very compact defense, and their almost priority at games is to remain compact as opposed to creating significant chances. And that's also why they're one of the least high-scoring teams within the league. As far as the 4.9 to 5.2 options, Cucurella is definitely a new option. He's someone that we actually mentioned several weeks ago, but Brighton did hit a very rough patch where they were constantly kind of dealing with injuries to players like Dunk, to Duffy, and things like that. And they did struggle during that period, and that's why Cucurella found his way out of the list. However, we've seen recently that Brighton have kind of hit the upswing in a sense and have had several good games amongst the Chelsea game where Cucurella did get a late assist for Welbeck. We've already seen 3 games in the season where Cucurella has stacked up 3 bonus points back to back, in fact, actually, in the last 2 weeks. And the nice beneficial thing about Cucurella is that he basically is a bonus points farmer. He's the same thing as Reguilon, where he creates a lot of crossing opportunities in open play himself. He doesn't necessarily get into too many attacking spots that Reguilon does, like a left inside forward or like a left winger, but the amount of chances that he does create and the way that Brighton play are very beneficial towards his play style, where he's able to cross all day into players who should be intercepting these crosses. and actually taking and making something out of it. And that's something that we saw in the Chelsea game, which is why Cucurella is interesting. He also has a very kind of smooth fixture run ahead, so that's interesting. And the double game week possibilities are also quite good for Cucurella. So owning maybe Sanchez at this point in time and Cucurella is not a bad option if you actually want to double up on Brighton. I wouldn't usually advise this. Maybe Cash is someone who you'd like to look at who's on this list if you want to kind of diversify your team and make sure that you don't hedge into one specific team. But these are as things stand. Laporte is someone who's a fantastic option at the 5.3 to 5.9 range. The only reason why he doesn't rise this week is just because of the fact that City have two single game weeks in 21 and 22, and the matches aren't going to be versus Arsenal and Chelsea. Now, whilst they obviously did pretty much destroy Arsenal and get the better of Chelsea as well, in a very convincing affair, I would say that those fixtures are still rather tough, and it's not the best time right now, I'd say, to have a double up for the City defense. I still think that this Arsenal team is on an upswing and they probably could score a goal versus City. And not only that, but I think the Chelsea game could be still quite a closely contested affair, especially if Chelsea are able to park the bus securely. So that's the thing. But I think Laporte becomes a fantastic option 23 onwards. Walker, by contrast, is someone who falls. He's just not interesting whatsoever, especially due to us not knowing exactly what his injury situation is. So that's going to be a big fall for Walker, who seemingly was a good option at that point in time. James and Rudiger is a kind of pairing that falls as well. I wanted to keep them within the tier of Alonso, and maybe in the future we'll see them actually drop to differentials, because it isn't an appetizing time to own Chelsea players. Whilst players like Mount and Alonso are in form and the fullbacks are still providing a lot of chances, the amount of clean sheets that they've dropped recently has been a very, very alarming sign. The expected goals allowed stat has kind of gone a little bit away from Chelsea. And whilst their midfield has recuperated, another injury towards James is going to be a big dampener on this team, who are already struggling a little bit with injuries and the kind of fixture congestion as well. There's also a little bit of tension in the team as well, with Lukaku kind of mentioning he hasn't really preferred playing in the new tactical style. So we'll see what happens. But in terms of the midfield, you've got changes to Gallagher, who seemingly is suffering from COVID, so that's going to make him miss out on the 21 fixture versus Newcastle, so that's not good at all. Gray is someone who rises, and I actually imagine that he could push up to becoming a very, very strong option in the near future, because Gray has very, very good fixtures ahead. He's very close to a game versus Norwich, where Norwich should recover and unfortunately kind of be rolled over by a lot of teams in the league, as they have in recent memory. Even though they've been playing a lot of second string players, we know that this Norwich team is very, very weak by contrast to a lot of teams in the league. Gray also performed very well even when Dominic Calvert-Lewin was in the team, so that's a good basis as well to say that I think he can continue his very, very good form this season, where he scored 5 goals and 3 assists. Gray is also interesting because he's very, very cheap, and he does allow you to kind of offset that money and place it in other areas right now, especially as we have a lot of cash disposable by going out of Salah. I would say Maddison also rises this week. Keep in mind that the Norwich fixture is going to be cancelled, so that's going to be a big detriment there, but Leicester do have a good run of games before they hit their kind of Chelsea fixture. So especially with Maddison being in form and us knowing that this attack is very capable of scoring goals, Maddison is definitely an option to be thinking about maybe in the future, and maybe even by game week 22, where he could be an interesting addition to your teams if you have the space to transfer in someone at that price point. Rafinha is someone who stays where he is. Unfortunately, the double game week isn't that good because there's a high chance it's going to be a Liverpool game. And I would still say that even though he's on penalties, which is actually the biggest plus so far, because in open play, I don't think Leeds have really been able to create any chances consistently. And the injuries, to the key personnel have really not benefited them. At this point in time, I think Rafinha's open play kind of chance creation has dropped and diminished a little bit. So he's kind of being saved by the fact that he's on penalties when Bamford is, out of the team. So I would say Rafinha still remains as a good option, not necessarily a great option compared to a Bowen, who, for example, is exceptionally in form. Lucas Moura, Tielemans, and Cornet are all interesting options. Cornet is definitely still injured. Lucas Moura is someone who unfortunately gets rotated too much, in my opinion, for us to actually consider him worthwhile, especially when assets so close to him are nailed and are more talismanic. Tielemans is unfortunately someone who might benefit from the Vardy injury that could hopefully push him further up into the field, maybe where Maddison even plays as a false 9. I don't really think there's a high chance that happens. We'll have to see what kind of tactical structure Leicester play around, because missing all the 3 key strikers is going to be huge, especially as Iheanacho heads towards AFCON and Daka and Vardy remain injured. So I'm cautious to kind of look at Tielemans at this point in time, but he could be an interesting gem within these weeks, maybe to capitalize on the lack of strikers. But we also know that on the flip side, this Leicester team could really struggle without having a focal point up top. Sterling and Mahrez, They do hit a rise for me this week, but I would actually say that Sterling is an interesting option because it seems like he does get rotated on a game-to-game basis. Perhaps it's not actually something you'd like to have to kind of play with, but Mahrez has also been an exception in form. The one big thing about Mahrez, however, is that he is heading towards AFCON, so that's going to be a big detriment. I would definitely not bring him into your team. But Mahrez has looked very interesting, as has Sterling as well, because of the fact that they're actually nailed on pens when they actually play games. So even though there is constant rotation at times with, let's say, Mahrez and Sterling, we could see that with Mahrez leaving and maybe Grealish being out of form, that Sterling could become a focal point during the next few weeks. And maybe I'll take Mahrez off the list and just kind of suggest that Sterling is a good option. He's right between the price point of Foden and KDB, so he's once again another great City midfielder to have. I wouldn't necessarily double up on the City midfielders at this point in time because they don't have doubles, but it's very interesting to probably keep at least one City player in your team structure because they've been exceptional and the midfielders have been performing really well. KDB remains exactly where he is. In fact, KDB might be an option I would say to probably be pushed up in the next week, right? Where after the double game week, KD becomes a very, very great option, or maybe an option to replace Salah if you'd like to keep him in this game for the Chelsea game. I'd probably not advise that. Salah's probably going to hit a downtrend for me, and he's going to be someone that you should sell from your teams as soon as possible because the Chelsea game doesn't look that great. And not only that, but at least after the Chelsea game, you're just not going to have him playing because of AFCON. So that's going to be the big impacts there. As far as the forwards, Broja is someone who actually rises. There's a high chance that the Newcastle game could be postponed, but I did read from a reputable source that the reason why the reason why the Newcastle game was postponed was actually because Mankilo or one of the other Newcastle defenders had to serve a suspension due to a yellow card. So that's going to have big impacts on whether that Southampton-Newcastle game happens. There could be a high chance that Southampton do play both Brentford and Newcastle in 1 week, which would be a fantastic double game week fixture for Broja. King still remains at the top, and Dennis unfortunately doesn't rise because he does head towards AFCON. King is an interesting option just because of the amount of plentiful fixtures that Watford have and the fact that he's on pens. Anything can really happen during that fixture run. I still think King is very worth keeping your team. Maybe Dennis could be phased out after this week if you'd like, or already if you don't really fancy the fixture versus Tottenham, and if no other kind of Game Week 21 fixtures are confirmed. But there's a high chance for doubles, so I think it's a good time to at least keep the Watford players and head towards the doubles with them, and then move out of them subsequently to maybe someone like Broja. Pukki is someone who falls. I think he's either injured or suffering from COVID, and it's a very unfortunate situation at Norwich where I just think that they're very clearly one of the worst teams in the league, unfortunately, and it's going to be a big struggle for Pukki to actually be worthwhile at this point in time. Edouard is someone who does rise because this Crystal Palace team has kind of jockeyed between both him and Benteke at times, but they have had great opportunities to score. Both of them have very favorable attacking stats, and that's going to be a huge plus if you're looking at those sorts of players and looking at Crystal Palace's fixtures. Their doubles aren't exactly great, so it could be a player that you actually look towards in the future if you, let's say, want to go out of King, maybe want to kind of push up in terms of the forwards, or if you want to, let's say, downgrade from someone like an Antonio or a Watkins or a DCL in the future if they're not performing very well. But he still remains as a differential. Antonio is on the rise this week. We've seen 1 goal and 1 assist from him in the last 2 games. That's not exactly the best totals because he has still been playing versus very diminished sides, especially a very kind of poor defense in this Watford team who suffered 3 assists or gave away 3 assists to Bowen. Antonio in that game only managed 1 assist, and his underlying stats haven't been exceptional recently, but they still have been on a bit of an uptrend from at least when he was completely blanking in the last few weeks. So I do see this as a great opportunity to own Antonio, especially he heads into a probable Norwich fixture between 21 and 22. DCL is someone who is new on this list. He, of course, was someone we took out due to the injury concerns, and simply put, the fixtures for Everton are very good. There's also very good probabilities for double game weeks. But the one concern is going to be his match fitness, right? He hasn't played in the Premier League in a long time. He has been playing in the under 21, under 23 games, but that's a very, very different scenario. And we know that sometimes players do struggle to kind of phase back into the games, especially with so much time out of the game. So we'll see what happens there. I do think Gray is a very good option if you want to go into Everton. I probably wouldn't double up on Everton right now. You could go for it. It would be a very risky gamble. DCL, we know, did start the season out exceptionally, and he is on pens. So that's going to be a huge plus if you get DCL. I would probably maybe wait and see how he performs and how fit he is before we actually go into him. But he definitely is an option to kind of think about, and it's definitely on my radar. Bamford and Wilson fall just because of the injury kind of concerns. Bamford should always have fallen for me, but I don't think anyone would really consider him as an injury option. And Wilson seems to be out for 3 to 4 months, which is, of course, really dismaying for him because he's had a good season so far when he's been able to play. But unfortunately, due to his injury proneness, it'll not be interesting. Vardy is someone who actually rises, but unfortunately, we do know that he's injured for 3 to 4 weeks, and then Leicester actually have some pretty bad games. So maybe actually Vardy, sorry, I would actually probably change that into saying that he stays exactly where he is, unfortunately, due to the injury concerns. Kane is someone who does actually rise 100% because he was very close to actually getting a 2-goal haul versus Southampton. And ultimately, I think Kane in open play has been very good. This team has also been building very consistent chances, which is always going to be a plus when you look at someone who's going to be a penalty taker. And that does set him apart from someone like Lukaku, who also rises just below him, because Lukaku doesn't get to take pens when Jorginho is on the pitch, and Jorginho is mostly on the pitch. And that's going to be a huge kind of detriment towards going for Lukaku, who also has blank game weeks ahead. Maybe he could be a good option on a free hit in potential weeks, but the fixtures just aren't good for Chelsea. But Lukaku does rise to a differential, just to kind of respect the kind of form that he's showing recently, especially since the Aston Villa game. Sanchez is someone who also goes on the rise, as Brighton have very, very good fixtures. And kind of contrasting him to Guaita, Guaita has been injured lately and just hasn't been an interesting option whatsoever, because we know this Crystal Palace defense unfortunately have struggled a little bit more than we'd have hoped for from a defensive point of view. Brighton, however, have accumulated rather good stats from an underlying point of view, and I think Sanchez is an interesting option. We saw a very, very good performance from him in the last 2 weeks, especially in a game versus Chelsea, where, you know, as long as a keeper gets 3 points versus Chelsea, I think you're pretty happy to own him. And he's a very good rotation option at this point in time, where maybe if you're preparing for a bench boost, you want to have that kind of second keeper, and he would be a very, very good backup keeper to have during that run. Lloris is someone who also rises as well. I have to kind of point out that Tottenham are actually second in the league in terms of expected goals allowed, and that puts them basically as the second best defense as City, if you actually believe in that metric, as a good kind of aggregator of how well a team has done in terms of reducing effective chances created versus them from a kind of statistical point of view. However, I think there's an even larger positive with Lloris because of the fact that we know that there was a pre-Conte era and a post-Conte era. And post-Conte, they basically bagged 4 clean sheets out of 6, and they've done tremendously well during this period, getting very good results versus Liverpool, maybe slipping up versus an Everton and Southampton in draws. But the fact that they've gone undefeated during this time is a very huge plus, and Lloris becomes a very interesting option, even as your kind of go-to keeper for the rest of the season. So that's it, guys, for this video. I hope you guys do extremely well this week, and I will be releasing a wildcard video very shortly off the back of this, so please stay tuned for that.